Welcome, everybody, on behalf of Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am pleased to welcome you to the museum's virtual discussion with Paul Kester, a Holocaust survivor from Germany. Before we begin, I would like to share a few words about the museum. Holocaust Museum LA is the first Holocaust survivor-founded Holocaust museum in the United States. In the 1960s, a group of survivors worked together to create a memorial for their loved ones who perished in the Holocaust, and this memorial eventually became Holocaust LA. The Survivors Museum did so to commemorate, educate, and inspire generations. Furthermore, they mandated that our museum should always be free to the public, making Holocaust education accessible to everyone. Even though we are not able to be in our museum's physical space for the time being, we are still able to carry forward their mission. This morning, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Paul Kester, who will share his story with you. After Paul shares his story, you will have the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A box. For those watching on Zoom and those watching on Facebook can use the comment section, and Paul will answer as many questions as possible. Paul has been a part of our museum community for so many years, speaking to all sorts of student groups, participating in all sorts of our educational programs, and it's really my honor to welcome him. Thank you so much for being with us this early afternoon and for sharing your story with us.
Thank you, Michael. So my name is Paul Kester. Who am I? I'm a member of a tiny minority. A minority of Jewish children born in Europe after the First World War during the 1920s or 1930s, who were still alive in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. You see, when we talk about the Holocaust, usually we remember the 6 million Jews who were murdered by the Nazis. Well, included part of the 6 million, there were more than 1,500,000 children who were killed. I was not one of them. I was lucky. So let me tell you my story. I was born in 1925 in Germany, in a town called Wiesbaden near Frankfurt, West Germany. A town of about 300,000 citizens. And there was a small Jewish community of about 3,000, or just barely 1% of the population. My family had dated back in over the centuries, they had lived in West Germany. And we were quite assimilated. My parents, my grandparents felt this was their home, this was their country. My father had fought in the First World War. My grandfather was a member of city government on a pro bono basis. And my early memories go back to the late 1920s when I was 4, 5, or 6 years old. I had a sister who was 2 years older. And the two of us, we had a very happy, normal childhood, even though my earliest memories go back to the late 20s, early 30s, the time of the Great Depression. And I remember poverty, beggars coming to our house. We lived in an apartment building. They would ring our bell and ask for some bread or some pennies. And I also remember that there were political activities in town. I could see the signs and the flags of different parties. The socialists, the liberals, the Nazis, each doing their propaganda, trying to get votes for the next election. They seemed to happen at that time quite often. But all of a sudden, I started school in 1932. And I remember in 1933 that the different flags and propagandas from the other parties disappeared. The Nazis had gained power. Hitler had become chancellor and very quickly established a dictatorship, eliminating other parties, the members of which either switched to the Nazis or left the country or were incarcerated in what became known as concentration camps. What I remember of those early days were signs in town declaring that in big letters, and I could read it, I just learned to read, declaiming that the Jews are our misfortune, the Jews are criminals, the Jews are thieves, the Jews are guilty that we lost the First World War. It was difficult for me to understand. My parents, my relatives, my grandparents, friends of the family, none of them were known as criminals. So to reconcile the official propaganda, the official ideology of Jews being a race of poor, of criminals and thieves versus the Aryans. It didn't make sense. But children adopt and accept life, and our life was relatively undisturbed. In school, I was the only Jewish boy in a class of 35, but I was treated like everybody else. So as long as I did my homework and behaved, I was not singled out just because of belonging to a different religion. It was different for the adults. I remember my grandmother, we had this fairly large store in town, clothing, and the neighbor next door would greet my grandmother every morning when my grandmother came to the store. But after 1933, she would not do that anymore. Events like this were much harder on the adults than for us as children. And we only could sense a certain problem at home. I remember the Nazis passed in 1935 what became known as the Nurnberg Laws, where Jews no longer were, we became residents, but we were no longer German citizens. And there were other restrictions. And I remember my grandmother saying, I'm glad that my husband, my grandfather, had died half a year earlier. These changes and these new laws would have been very much depressing for him to accept. Anyhow, in 1936, I started high school at age 10. There were 3 high schools in Wiesbaden for boys. Education in those days was not co-educational. Boys and girls went to separate schools. And my father tried to enroll me in one of the 3 high schools, was told by the principal that the school was 100% Nazi, and he could not accept security for me. That was basically a refusal. And the second school had a different excuse. The third school accepted me and also my close friend, Leo, who lived in a few houses away from where we lived, and with whom I had grown up. And we shared the walk to the school. And after the first year, we had to sit together to be separate from the other boys. Now, at high school, we were not mistreated. The education was geared towards the new Nazi ideals. Physical education became very important, but I belonged to the Jewish sports club. I could handle any sport events, any lectures in swimming or athletics or whatever was required, at least as well as the other boys. Now, that we also had at one time, I think the second class, I was 11 years old. The teacher was either in biology or geography, that he started to explain the different races. So on one side of the class, he put up posters showing members of the Jewish race, ugly faces, big noses, ears, big stomachs, features distorted. On the other side of the room, the Aryans, tall, blonde, straight noses, blue eyes. Now in Wiesbaden, a town in the Rhineland, there was no pure Aryan race. Nobody in the class looked quite like what they showed on the wall. I would say at the time I was blonde and had a straight nose. I looked more Aryan than the rest of the kids. At the end of the lecture, the teacher said, yes, we have 2 Jewish boys in this class, and they don't look like the Jews on the pictures here on the wall. But keep in mind, boys, this is a class in theory. Well, the teacher had spoken. He was a voice of authority, and there were no questions. Many years later, in Germany, when I spoke to German high school students at the school where I had been a student before, the students asked me, how could a teacher tell such nonsense? I could only answer that that the curriculum had been passed down to the teacher by the Nazi Department of Education. And if he wouldn't follow that, he would have been probably lost his position and being identified as an opponent of the Nazi government. The years went on. People's Jewish friends and relatives started talking to leave Germany. Life for the Jews had become more difficult to exercise their professions, more difficult to run their businesses. My couple of cousins in their early 20s had been expelled from the universities, and they left Germany and went to what at that time was called Palestine. Others went to the United States or to England. But for my family to leave Germany, where the business was still going on, to go to a foreign country without money, at that time, restrictions were such that Jews who left Germany could only take personal possessions. To go to a foreign country where you didn't speak the language, where your profession was disallowed, where you couldn't run a business, you came as a beggar. It was a decision that was not easily made, especially where you had such deep roots in the town and the country where you lived and where your ancestors had lived for many centuries. But in 1938, some relatives in the United States said, we cannot help the whole family. They had to provide affidavits of support for us, for anyone who wanted to come to immigrate to the United States. But we are willing to take one of the children. My sister, being the older one, was given that affidavit and an immigration visa at the American consulate. And in June of 1938, she left for the United States. My mother still took her to Hamburg. In those days, one traveled by boat. And I was kind of jealous. I wanted also to go to America. But my life continued. 1938, I still went on my annual vacation trip to my relatives on the countryside. And continued school. But in November, it was the 10th of November, 1938, I remember that an administrator came to our class around 10 o'clock in the morning and told my friend Leo and me to go home, that there were problems in town and we better should join our families. When I came home, my mother and grandmother were pretty much upset. When they had tried to go to our store, they had to pass a synagogue, and the synagogue was in flames. And stores, Jewish stores that still existed, were being looted and vandalized and destroyed. It was, my father had earlier gone to the store and found a large crowd of people in front, busy smashing windows, show windows, and glass cabinets, busy vandalizing and smashing whatever people could. My father was told to follow a couple of policemen. He managed to in the crowd to disappear and went into hiding because all men at the age of 16 to 60 at that time, at that day, were being arrested by the Nazis. We went to school the next day back and were called to the principal's office, my friend Leo and I, and were told that from now on, no Jewish children were allowed anymore to attend German schools. Well, we went home, and the day after, my father came back from hiding. Supposedly, the arrests of the men had stopped. But that evening, we lived in an apartment. The doorbell rang. I opened it. There was a man in civilian's clothing asking to see my father. He identified himself as a member of the Gestapo, the secret police, and told my father to follow him. And within minutes, my father was gone. My mother quickly asked me to get on my bike and visit some of our Jewish friends to warn them that the arrests of men had started again. It was a dismal November evening. I remember the atmosphere of despair and I'm concerned with what's going to happen next. My mother and I the next day went to the police to find out where's my father. We were not told anything. A few days later, we learned that he had been sent to Dachau, a concentration camp that gained much more notoriety in 1945 when Americans liberated it and the world learned about the Nazi atrocities that had taken place there, the killings and torture. Since I couldn't go back to school, I had to go with my mother every day to the store to clean it up. The mountains of broken glass had to be disposed of. I still remember that at night, often I couldn't sleep because I had the noise of broken glass still in my ears. And the thought was, what is happening to our men? We learned that a cousin of mine had died in Buchenwald, another concentration camp. Later on, we found out that he had been beaten to death by one of the Nazi guards. Other friends and relatives got messages of men having died in the concentration camps. One day, we learned that some men were supposed to come back from concentration camps, so my mother sent me to the railroad station to see if my father was there. He was not, but I saw some of the men that had returned, getting off the train, a view of that I won't forget, see these men who had been doctors, lawyers, well-situated businessmen coming back from a concentration camp, now dirty, pale, looking a mess. The mistreatment and the hardship that they had suffered, quite visible in their looks and in their appearances. Well, the question was, what do we do? It obviously, the pogrom, the November pogrom of 1938 in Germany, where all the synagogues were burned, where all the stores were smashed, where all the men were sent to concentration camps, was the obvious beginning of the end for Jews in Europe. And everybody, in our family, my friends, said, how can we get out? Where can we go? You could get out, the Nazis wouldn't keep you as long as you didn't take anything of value along. But what country would take you? Where could you go? Nobody opened their borders. Nobody wanted us. But then we learned that some countries would take children. England said, we take 10,000. France, Holland, Belgium, Switzerland took a few each. And my father was still in the concentration camp, put me on whatever list was there for children to get to another country. My friend Leo, who had relatives in Holland, in early December, left. I bid him goodbye at the train station in Wiesbaden, envious that he could get out and I was still left behind. But a couple of days later, we get a letter from a distant relative in Sweden that Sweden would take 500 children. And this relative was a teacher at a Jewish refugee boarding school. And that school was supposed to take 20 or 30 of those 500 children that were coming to Sweden, were allowed to come to Sweden. And within a couple of days, I get a letter from the Swedish embassy in Berlin, the capital of Germany, that I would get a permit that I was allowed to come to Sweden. That automatically eliminated me from any other country, and Sweden it would be for me. It also so happened that a few days later, my father returned from Dachau, from the concentration camp. He had survived the ordeal fairly well. He always was very strong, physically active, and had managed to endure the hardship reasonably well. So, what do I have to do to get to Sweden? My father figured out that there was an honorary Swedish consul at a German large chemical factory. And we got an appointment to see this man. He was a high executive of that German industrial enterprise. And my father said, what does one have to do? They organize transports for children to England, but we haven't heard anything about transport to Sweden. So the man said, don't wait for any transport. Put your son on a train, get him out. It was good advice. My father and I made a quick trip to the countryside to relatives. I remember we spent Christmas Day there, Christmas Eve. The family had gotten together. My father had 3 brothers. They all had come back from concentration camps. And it was a sad, depressing family meeting, a place where I had spent many glorious summer vacations. And now it was a place where my family could only say what to do, where to go, how to survive. Anyhow, we get back to Wiesbaden. My personal belongings get packed under the supervision of German police, make sure I only take personal clothing and belongings of no value. On the 9th of January, exactly 2 months after the start of the pogrom, I bid my family goodbye. We exchanged a few more words expressing the hope for an early reunion. And the train takes off from Wiesbaden to Berlin, where a cousin meets me, and where I, within a couple of days, receive my entry permit for Sweden from the Swedish embassy in Berlin. On the 15th of January, 1939, I'm on a train from Berlin through northern Germany to the Baltic Sea, and from there on a ferry across to southern Sweden. I remember that train ride. I remember the last inspection by a man in his black uniform, Gestapo, secret police, checking my little suitcase. My other luggage had been sent ahead. There was a book, and he said, no books allowed. He took it. I couldn't care less as long as I get out. We knew that Jews could take along, when they left Germany, the total sum of 10 marks, equivalent of, at that time, of $5. But we weren't sure if I, as a child, was allowed to do that. So my cousin who took me to the train said, spend the money on the train so you won't have any problems. I spent the 10 marks in the dining car on some candies, and now I was traveling to Sweden, a foreign country, with a total sum of the equivalent of 10 cents in my pocket. We get to Sassnitz, the harbor in northern Germany. The train gets on a ferry. The ferry moves. It's a kind of a foggy January afternoon, 15th of January, 1939. The ferry starts moving, and I see the coastline of Germany slowly disappearing. And I remember I had a tremendous sense of relief. I had gotten out of Germany. I was lucky. I had gotten out of I had been able to leave Germany, a country where now it was a crime to be a Jew. I get met by relative in station where I arrived by train. in Sweden. I joined, I become one of the children in this refugee boarding school. I lived there for the next year and a half. The youngsters at that school, they were all more or less in the same situation that I was, became friends. They became family in a way. And one of the kids there, quite a few years, 10 years later, actually became my wife. And we all shared same kind of experiences and became lifelong friends. During many of our travels, we would get reunited, or they would come and visit us here in Los Angeles. In September of 1939, the Second World War started by Germany invading Poland. During those early years, I was still in contact with my family in Wiesbaden. There was no phones in those days, no email, no texting. We wrote letters. Every week I wrote a letter to them and they wrote to me. And the mail functioned pretty well. Except when the war started, letters to or from Germany were opened by the German authorities to make sure that they did not contain any writing that was not to the liking of the Nazi examiners. I still have letters where certain sections are blacked out. Some years ago, I tried to figure out what was written underneath. And I was told that the Los Angeles Police Department has a machine that could read through this black cover. Well, they showed it to me. Not only was the handwriting black, but it was actually chemically wiped out. So there was no writing to be seen even through this kind of an X-ray machine. I stayed in contact with my family. In 1940, actually, that school was closed. I went to another children's home. This was all under the auspices of the Jewish community in Stockholm, capital of Sweden. And I could go attend Swedish school, high school, until the age of 16. At 16, in summer of 1942, I moved to Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, and went to work at the Jewish community as an office clerk and continued my education by going to night school. I wanted to continue high school, so maybe to be able to ultimately pursue an academic career. Well, we've learned that Jews in Germany were started to getting deported to Eastern Europe, to ghetto towns, and that they had to leave their residences in Germany. In August of 1942, my parents wrote to me that it now was their turn. They were not sure where they went, but maybe to Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. They were not sure if we could stay in contact by mail but I should try it, if not, maybe through the Red Cross. Well, I sent cards to them, registered mail, with return receipts to Theresienstadt. And within days, I got their signatures, and they marked down their address in this Theresienstadt, the ghetto town in what is now the Czech Republic. They could write short letters, and they would receive my letters. But a few months later, in early 1943, my letters to them came back with a remark that they had departed and were no longer at this ghetto town. I knew that that was bad news, and later learned that they had been sent from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz in what's now southern Poland, where they were gassed and murdered upon their arrival. My grandmother stayed on in Theresienstadt. I could send her mail, even some small packages, but she died in May of 1944, 1 year before the end of the war and liberation. She died of starvation and ill treatment, which in a way was lucky because she was scheduled to be sent to Auschwitz only a few days later. I lived in Stockholm for the next few years. It was a good life. I worked, I studied. But in 1948, I decided to migrate to the United States, even though life in Sweden was pleasant. But I did not like the Soviet Union's encroachment on Eastern Europe, and I did not want to be in Europe if there was been another war. I'd also done some traveling to Western Europe, including Germany. I'd seen the destruction and being in my early 20s, adventurous and wanting to join my sister and relatives in the United States, I decided I'd make the move and give it a try. I arrived in Los Angeles in January of 1949. I've lived here ever since. We started typical immigrant's life, all kinds of jobs. I again went to night school, became a CPA. In 1954, I joined a small accounting firm where I spent the next 35, 40 years of my professional career. We were successful. We worked hard, but it was stimulating and gratifying. And we had regained what I would call a normal life. Yes, my childhood had sad experiences, but looking back, I think I've been very lucky. I was lucky that my parents were willing to let us children leave Germany, not knowing if we would ever see each other again. I was lucky that I got to Sweden, and not as like my friend Leo, who went to Holland and which was occupied by the Nazis, and from where he was deported also to Auschwitz in 1942. I was lucky that Hitler lost the war. It assured my survival. I was lucky I had a very happy marriage. I have a son, two granddaughters, and I can look back now and say, it's been a good life. And I can only tell my listeners, enjoy the freedom and democracy that you have and protect it. Nothing is guaranteed, but don't hate, be tolerant. That's been my rule, and that I tell my many students that I speak here and in Germany. I thank you for listening. I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Paul, for sharing your story with us this afternoon. We do have some questions for you. The first one is, what were some of the first things that you and your family noticed were changing as soon as Hitler came to power?
Obviously, the disappearance of any opposition, no more flags by socialists or communists or anybody else. The Nazi flags were all over the map. The propaganda, official propaganda against the Jews, the destruction, the burning of books, the definition by the Nazis of what was acceptable art, the quick elimination of Jews from positions, official positions, be it in city or state or federal government. And the sometimes separation by Gentiles who had been friendly or been friends, who no longer wanted to or felt comfortable to associate with us, the Jews. This was not, I couldn't say that everybody did that. Some separated themselves from us, others remained friends, except maybe being more careful so they wouldn't be accused of being too friendly to us who were, after all, the enemies. Any other question, Michael?
Thank you so much. You mentioned going back to Germany. Have you specifically been back to Wiesbaden?
Yes. I went back when I still lived in Sweden as early as 1947. One of my father's brothers, who was married to Catholic, had survived. He was in a somewhat privileged position. His deportation was not commenced until early 1945. By that time, the extermination camps in Poland had already been liberated by the Soviet army, but he was still sent to Theresienstadt, but managed to survive. So I visited him, and I also went to Wiesbaden and went with one of the fellow from the police to the apartment where we used to live. And the police took me, we went into the apartment, not to the delight of the then occupants, tenants. And I saw the apartment that I had left 8 years earlier, pretty much the same way as I remembered it. Our furniture, our carpets, our cupboards, our cabinets, our beds were still there. An inventory was taken, and the then tenants ultimately had to pay a small sum of, I had no use for it. I've been back to Germany several times since, including Wiesbaden. In the late 1980s, I even got a letter from a teacher at the school which I had attended until the age of 13, wanting to find out what had happened to their Jewish students at the time of when we were terminated. There were 8 Jewish students, and I could report to the teacher who wanted to know what had happened to us, that 4, including myself, had gotten out of Germany, and 4 had been murdered by the Nazis, including my friend Leo. I said that I found it interesting that it took them 50 years to develop any interest in what had happened to us. But this inquiry was part of the school writing a book about education during the Nazi era at that school. And it so happened that we were in Germany when that book was published. And it was the first time that I then, in 1992, spoke to high school students at the school, where I was welcomed by the principal, by the successor of the principal, who had told us we could no longer attend. And I was asked to speak to the students. And I welcomed their questions, which were searching, interesting, and during subsequent visits, the last one as late as the summer of 2019, that I still visit Wiesbaden, and during that, like last year, when I was back in Wiesbaden, I spoke at 3 high schools, by now co-ed, and an adult venue about my life as a Jewish boy in Nazi Germany. I always welcome their questions. Sometimes they ask me, the German students of today, do I think that they are guilty? At which time I answer, I say, you are not guilty of what happened during the lifetime of your grandparents, or more likely your great-grandparents. But you have an obligation, a historical obligation to know your country's history, to make sure that this kind of event will never happen here again, and that you have to be protective of the freedom, of the democracy, of the well-being that you currently enjoy. And my message to them is what I also tell students in this country: do not hate. You don't have to love people, you don't have to like them, but you have to respect them, never mind what accent, what language, what color. Protect your own and others' human dignity. Be tolerant. More questions, Michael?
Thank you very much. What happened to your sister?
My sister lived first in New York and later moved to Los Angeles, where we got reunited. She married here and has 2 children with whom I'm still in close contact. One nephew lives here in Los Angeles, and my niece in Sacramento. We are a close family. My sister and brother-in-law have passed away, so that's my wife. So I am the only super senior, as we call it, still around. And I cherish the relationship I have with them. And of course, with my son, who lives back east, and his wife and adult granddaughters.
Thank you very much. Can you please tell us a little bit about your wife and where she was from, and how she got to Sweden, and if her family survived?
She was born in Berlin, Germany. Came to this boarding school in Sweden much earlier, I think in 1935. She came to Stockholm before I did, and we had always had contact. When I came to Stockholm in 1942, we reconnected and eventually started to date and marry. Her background is her parents were divorced. The mother remained in Berlin, remarried, and also wound up in Auschwitz. The father and his wife lived in Stockholm, where he died in the mid-1970s. And my wife had a sister and brother. The brother also got to Sweden and ultimately to this country. Her sister, instead of couldn't come to Sweden because she was too old. She was 2 years older than my wife and didn't qualify as a child under the 500 that could come to Sweden. Instead, what at the time, long before the war, went to Paris, France, was interned during the war, managed to escape, lived underground in France for 2-3 years, had a very difficult time, but made it. Then after the war came to Sweden, married a Jewish boy in Stockholm, and they too came to Los Angeles. Decided to join us a few years after we had gotten here.
Thank you so much. What did it feel like to be back in Germany? And do you remember specifically seeing your old house or the places in Wiesbaden that you grew up looking at? And how did that feel to you?
It's always memories of many details come back to your mind. When I'm at the apartment house where we lived, I can only sometimes try to visualize what it must have been like when my parents and my grandmother, at the end of August 1942, with some little hand luggage, had to leave the apartment, walk to a synagogue, not the one that went up in flames, but another one that now became a assembly for the Jews, remaining Jews from Wiesbaden. And from there, they then had to march to the railroad station, not the regular central station, but a line nearby where they had to board the train towards their ultimate destination. Wiesbaden has a memorial where the synagogue that had been burned is now a memorial to the 1,500 Jews, each name engraved in a large wall, with, of course, the names of my family, many friends, and what I sometimes or always especially feel is when I see the names of my friend Leo and of about 100 other youngsters who had been not as lucky as I was. There's another memorial at the then train station from where the Jews were sent off. And what they do in Germany now is in front of the apartment building where we lived, in the pavement, there are small bronze plaques listing the name of each Jewish occupant that at one time resided in that building and what their ultimate date was. Like for my parents would be the name when they were born and death, Auschwitz, 1943. So the town, and for me, is a memorial. It brings back memories of a very happy childhood, early childhood, but also the events that ultimately upended and shattered that childhood.
Thank you so much. We have a question here from a third grade teacher who would like to share your story with her students. And what is one main thing that you would like to tell specifically a class of third graders?
Third graders are about, what, 9 years old?
Yes, roughly 9 years old.
But my life was like being Jewish in Germany as a child. And some of the details. And what I would ask them or tell them is emphasize that all human beings are alike. What the Nazis did was making killing and persecution to a national program. And I would tell them that here, they should enjoy and be aware that they live in a free country. Yes, we have differences, ethnic, religious. People have a tendency to be tribal, but there's no excuse for looking down or not tolerating the child next to you. It is important to learn from the early stage that all humans are alike and we have to respect each other. We have seen yesterday where some tried to violate those freedoms. A sad spectacle. May it never happen again. We live in a difficult time, a pandemic, and yes, I find it some difficult at the age of 95 to cope with some of this. But I remind myself that my early life had much larger dangers and problems than what we experience today, especially since we here have the hope and the ambition to overcome whatever problems we face without having to be afraid of being, by state action, being persecuted or killed. And it comes back to that. I would tell that to 9-year-olds. It's a message I gave to a German girl whom I had on Zoom a couple of weeks ago, who did a school project in Wiesbaden about my story. Any other questions, Michael?
Thank you so much. We have several comments from our viewers who were just thanking you for sharing your story. Somebody said, your positive attitude and gratitude are wonderful, as well as your determination to work hard, study, and become a successful professional. And they thank you so much for sharing with us. As I said, Paul has been such an important part of our community, sharing his story with students at the museum before the pandemic and now on Zoom regularly. So we thank you so much for sharing this story and your message. And I know it's an honor for everybody watching today to listen to you, and we thank you so much.
I thank you for listening, and I wish you well.
Thank you, and you as well. And we wish everybody a happy, healthy, and safe weekend. And please continue to follow our website and our social media. You can see our virtual programs are online. We have Survivor Talks every Thursday. If you are a teacher or know a teacher and are who is interested in a virtual tour of the museum with a survivor talk for your class, please contact us as well. You can go to our website, hmla.org, short for holocaustmuseumla.org. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you very much, Paul.